There have been quite a lot of updates this year. Hi everyone, welcome back to the Lakbyte channel. I'm Marian from Lakbyte, and we've helped over 800 people move to Spain on several different visas. Today we're going to be talking about all the updates to the Digital Nomad Visa, specifically for 2026, since we're already over almost half the year, and there have been quite a lot of updates this year. So first off, one of our most common questions, income requirement. So for 2026, so that you aren't confused, we will be flashing on the screen what the 2026 income requirement actually is for this year. One of the other common questions that we get around this is, does this amount actually increase yearly? And historically, especially when I check past years, over the past 7 to 10 years or so, it has historically increased by around 3 to 5%. And why is this the case? Because remember, the income requirement for Spain's Digital Nomad Visa actually is based on Spain's minimum working wage. So every time that amount increases, then of course the corresponding income increase will also be applied for the income requirements for the DNV. One of the other things that we've also noticed around this year is that historically people would normally have an easier time meeting the income requirements. But with how bad the currency exchange currently is with respect to other countries or several different countries around the world, it's also become increasingly common for people to use savings to top up the difference between the income requirement required as well as the amount that they're currently earning. And how that is usually calculated is, if, for example, you miss the income requirement by, let's say, 100 euros, normally you would multiply this by 36 months because normally the visa is granted or the residence authorization is granted for a period of 3 years. That's how it usually goes. And it is really one of the biggest things that we've noticed an increase in because really of the currency exchange rate. Okay? Now, let's talk about general application paths. So we know that you can apply for the digital nomad visa either as an employee or as a self-employed individual. And for if you are applying as an employee, and remember what we mean by employee is that your employer is actually the one withholding your taxes, your social security, any healthcare benefits, etc. Meaning you're a legitimate employee, and usually if you're in the same country, usually this is the case, you there there are only a few countries that would allow you to apply this way. So normally if you're coming from other European Schengen states, the UK, the US, for example, and we've seen these applications still go through this year, even for the more complicated W-2 applications if you're coming from the US. Now let's talk about self-employed applicants. And this is where a lot of the changes have happened. So in December again last year, one of the changes that they started requesting was that you have to show some sort of proof that you are registered as self-employed in your country of origin. Between, I would say, December and February, they didn't qualify this with a certain period. So it was enough that you showed some sort of proof. However, by February, they then started specifically limiting this to a certain time period. So now they were now asking that when you apply as self-employed, you have to show that you've been registered as such for at least 3 months by the time that you submit your application. Okay, so I see a lot of instances of this for applicants who are coming from countries where it is not a custom or it is not a norm to register beforehand. They have to delay their timeline by a little bit so that they can proceed with the application and make sure that their proof of registration as self-employed has been active for at least 3 months. So depending on the country that you're coming from, these can look very different. So it will really depend what you have in your country. So it can be some sort of sole proprietorship registration, some sort of license, trade license, a freelance license. It may be some sort of registration with your trade authority, with your social security system, with your tax system. It can also be tax returns as a self-employed individual. So there's a lot of variety of documents that you can provide. It's not an exhaustive list. As long as it is sufficient to prove that you've been registered as self-employed for at least 3 months, that should be sufficient for this purpose. One of the other general requirements that we still see a lot of questions about is regarding experience and degree. So with the degree, this is of course much more straightforward. So if, for example, you're an accountant, you have an accounting degree. If you're a software developer, you have an IT degree. Those ones are pretty simple and straightforward to explain. And normally, if you are engaged as a client with Lakbyte, it's our obligation, or it is part of the services that we would actually explain like how your degree is related to your current role, especially for those where there might be a little bit of a reach between your degree and then what you're currently doing. The more complicated path is using the 3-year experience requirement route. And it is more complicated, but as long as you're able to adequately prove it, it is still doable. Now, remember, to prove 3 years of experience, you have to always provide 2 things. Okay, so once is always going to be a certificate of experience, and on the other hand, official government proof that you were actually working those years. So it's not enough that you get a certificate that would say, for example, like Marian von Stembroek has worked with us as a lawyer for 2022 to 2025, and then that's it. No, you have to provide on top of that certificate of experience, or on top of that letter of experience, government proof that you were actually working those years. So these ones usually take the form of either payments to your social security system, tax returns for those years, a work-life history report, again, depending on the country and the documents that that country normally issues. But as long as it's an official government document which will accredit that you were working those years, and even better if it actually accredits the actual position, then that can be used to prove that you have 3 years of legitimate experience related to the role that you're currently doing. And when we talk about the role that you're currently doing, whether you are accrediting via experience or via degree, it is the remote work role that you are using to apply. Okay, so you can't use it to accredit like your previous role, for example. It has to be related, your degree and your experience has to be related to your actual role that you're using to apply for the digital nomad visa for. Which brings me to the most basic requirements that you will always have to get, whether you're an employee or whether you are a contractor. So it's always going to be 3 things: a contract, the letter authorizing you to work remotely from Spain, and the certificate of registration of your company showing that they've been established for at least 1 year. So the contract, that can be an employment contract or a freelancer arrangement. The remote work letter, of course, it must explicitly authorize you to work remotely from Spain, and the certificate of incorporation or good standing showing that the client has been established for at least 1 year. So it can come in many different names. It can be a certificate of existence, certificate of fact. It can be an extract from a trade register. It can be some sort of trade license. So again, what is important is that it is able to prove that the company that you are providing services to as a contractor or as an employee has been registered and existing for at least 1 year. Okay, so now that we've talked about more of the general requirements or the general qualifications for the digital nomad visa, let's talk a little bit more logistics, because I also see quite a lot of questions around this lately. So first off is the EES system. So this launched back in April, and one of the biggest questions that we had around this is what would actually suffice as proof that you have entered Spain when Spain wasn't stamping anymore. Okay, so what I can confirm is that for our applicants who've submitted since around April and May, they have been getting approved as long as you're able to show that you have either the boarding pass or the airline certificate to prove that you have actually entered Spanish territory. Because remember, the digital nomad visa application, it's done completely online. but the entire application hinges on the fact that you are able to validly prove entry into Spanish territory, because even if it's online, you are basically telling them that, hey, I'm in Spanish territory, I'm applying for residence authorization. So you might think that, oh, boarding pass, flight finished, let's just throw it. No, it's actually one of those papers that you should keep. And then the airline certificate, usually you're able to request this from the airline themselves. So if you're traveling with popular carriers like Emirates, Cathay, Qatar, a lot of them already have procedures for it. So usually you can just access it through their online portal, customer service, or there are relevant pages that you can access this. And again, if you are a client, we have already instructed you how to do this, especially if it's a very popular airline that we see a lot of. Now, other changes also involve bank statements. Previously, it was very easy to just, for example, download your online bank statement and then directly use that for the application. But it has now been implemented, I would say, as a new requirement that if you are coming, or if your bank has a brick and mortar store where you can actually get it stamped or signed, that is the preferred way of authenticating your bank statement, so to speak. But if it's an online bank, for example, N26, PayPal, Payoneer, they will normally request that these be notarized because, of course, you wouldn't be able to go to a local branch to have it stamped and signed. That encapsulates the changes regarding bank statements that we've been seeing more strictly implemented since around April to May this year. Okay, let's talk more general application types. So, student visa holders. Again, I've been seeing a lot of people planning to come to Spain on a student visa, and then once they're here, that's when they transition to the DNV. I want to caution people who are planning to do this path that it is very risky, because to transition now from the student visa to the DNV, you have to show that you have been registered as self-employed for at least 3 months here in Spain and paying social security and taxes here. Okay? So it was not as simple as before, where as long as you showed proof of income, the relevant contracts, etc., then you could validly renew and apply for your DNV. This time around, it definitely is not the case. It hasn't been the case since the start of this year. So be careful if this is your plan. You can only do this if your TIE or if your student visa actually gives you a right to work in Spain and you properly register for social security and taxes before you apply for the DNV. Okay? So next is business owners. So in one of our videos earlier this year, we actually mentioned there that it might not be possible to apply as a business owner anymore. But based on several applications between January to this month, it is apparently still possible. But again, we will again caution that these are more complicated applications because you're trying to prove that your business can actually qualify you for the income requirement and that it is a legitimate, real, existing, and operating business. So it is possible, still possible as of June 2026, but again, complicated and tricky. Another one that we also commonly get is, can content creators actually apply for the digital nomad visa? And generally the answer is yes. However, you normally would have to either create a company and make sure that that company has existed for at least 1 year, route your earnings through that company, and then pay yourself as a service provider to that own company. So it is a bit of a workaround, but it is definitely still possible. Now let's talk renewals, because we are at the point at the digital nomad visa journey. I would say journey because it is a very young visa still, that a lot of people are starting to renew already. Now, people think that just because it's a renewal, oh, it's gonna be easy. I already have the 3 years, or I already have the 1 year, so it's easy to just renew. Note that a renewal is effectively the same as an initial application. You have to prove that you have a degree or 3 years of experience, that you are properly registered, that you are paying your taxes and social security here, especially if you're renewing from Spain. Remember that in the initial years of the DNB, I would say the first year or two, it was very easy to prove your years of experience because all people had to do was really show a letter saying that so-and-so worked with us for so-and-so amount of time, and that was enough to prove years of experience. But now, any new changes to the digital nomad visa rules also apply to renewals. Meaning, for those who actually applied this way before, you have to make sure that you have certificates of experience, which are properly documented by official government documents showing you were actually working those years. So again, normally tax or social security records or a work-life history report, or this time prepare to use your degree to qualify. Because there were some people, because it was so easy to just renew, or it was just so easy to apply using certificate of experience, they just use it even if they had a degree. So if you do have a degree, then good for you. Just make sure that you prepare that document beforehand or before renewal. If you don't, make sure that you can trace years of work experience with the relevant tax and social security documents. Another thing that we've been seeing as well for renewals is the UE has been consistently inconsistent. There are documents that are asked for which shouldn't have been asked for even if they were already submitted during the initial application. So normally what we see this around is, for example, asking for a criminal check even if you've already presented your TIE. Because remember, the TIE will actually take the place of the criminal check for purposes of renewal, as long as, of course, it's still active. Second is they are also normally asked for proof of registration in their home country or country of origin when they've also already provided proof of registration in Spain. So little inconsistencies like this, when of course if you're doing it yourself and you've never seen it before, can sometimes surprise most people. Which brings me to my next point. We have seen a marked, and I do mean marked, increase of people who have done their applications themselves and find themselves in positions where they're denied and they've already overstayed either their Schengen days or their 1-year visa. Now, at least I have nothing against those who DIY. It's really fine because I know some people want to save money, they want to do this themselves. But at the minimum, at least try to get on a consult either with us or with someone who's familiar with the DNV so that you are at least guided if what you're doing is correct. On top of that, we've also seen a marked increase of people who first initially DIY their application and then they get back a long list of additional document requests and then they ask for our help at that point. Of course, we'll really try to help you if it's within our capability, but I would always say best to prepare so that you don't land into these kinds of situations. Because remember, normally when you receive an additional document request, you have 10 working days to submit the documents requested, and some of these documents will still have to be obtained from your home countries, and that can sometimes take time. And you know as well that not only will they have to be obtained, they will normally also have to be apostilled and then translated. And all those different steps also take time. And there's only a very limited number of days that you can use to prepare and submit it. And now that we're on the topic of additional documents, note that for the Spain Digital Nomad Visa, when they have new requests or when the requirements have changed, they don't actually announce this. So you will only find out that there are new changes affecting applicants if, for example, us or our fellow consultants start receiving requests for additional documents for documents that haven't been requested for before. So there's no formal announcement. We only will find out through our other applicants who are in the middle of the process, because then we start receiving additional requests for documents. So for example, very recently, the requests for bank statements. Normally, a lot of our requests in May was really just for that request for signed, stamped, or notarized bank statements. And this is also where going with someone who does this every day is very helpful, because then we are able to see what's working, what's not working, and what actually might move or might change with regard to the documents as it is applied to the visa. So let's talk timelines. Generally, they have to decide on your application within 20 working days. And 20 working days, I always say, is equivalent to, let's say, a month time. How long is it currently taking? So this is June 2026. It might be a different timeline in the future, but as of this month, they're really taking the full 17 to 20 working day period. Just last week, we actually received someone with 15 working days only, but that is rare at this time. Normally, they're really taking the full period. And what is also common right now is that they are just looking at main applicants' applications, meaning the dependents are being skipped. So they're asking for additional documents for the main applicants, or they're approving main applicants, but the dependents are being skipped. And what does being skipped mean? Because people say skipped and then they ask, like, are they not getting approved? No, it's not the case. They are still being processed, only most of them will go to administrative silence because they have gone over the 20 working day period, and it takes a while for their approval letters to be released. So it can happen, and it has happened, that the main applicant gets approved May 8th, for example, and then the dependents, whether that's a spouse, a child, a partner, a parent, only gets approved around 1 month after, or only gets the approval letter around 1 month after. And that is very normal right now. Another thing that's also very common is us having to request for administrative silence, because again, remember, they have to decide on the application within 20 working days. And if they don't, then you can validly request for approval via administrative silence. And normally at Lakbyte, we wait for the 20th working day, and then on the next working day, we then immediately file the request for administrative silence, which we'll also, of course, share with most of you. So if you're a previous client, you know this because we already plot when we expect the administrative silence date to be, and then we also tell you that we would file the request for approval by administrative silence immediately on the next working day. So if, for example, you file your application June 11, using the 20 working day period, it is expected that you will receive an approval by July 9, which means that if by midnight of July 9 there is no action or there is no response in your application, normally by July 10, which is the next working day, Friday, we will already submit the request for administrative silence approval. Which then brings me to the next part. You receive your approval letter, that very hard-fought approval letter. Don't make it go to waste by taking time to sign up for Social Security and tax. The only thing that you really need is a bank account. And for most banks in Spain, as long as you already have the approval letter and your passport, you should be able to directly open a bank account. And once you have that bank account, you can then sign up with many of the different providers to sign you up for Social Security and tax. Because the reason a bank account is needed is because you will nominate that bank account to be the auto-debiting entity for purposes of your taxes and Social Security. So Social Security is normally auto-debited monthly, and then taxes are quarterly, or when you or your accountant file. Now, why do we say sign up immediately for taxes and Social Security? If you don't, you will normally receive a letter from the UHE, and we will have access to this if we process your application. It's going to appear on the portal as a procedure that has been initiated. And that procedure that is initiated is a procedure or a notice of cancellation of your DNV for failure to actually comply with the conditions of the grant. Because one of the documents that you sign when you apply, or one of the documents that you submit with your application, is a promise to register for Social Security once you are approved. And of course, this is a natural consequence of you delaying this registration. Not only that, you can effectively, of course, still save your residency. It doesn't mean that if you receive that notice that your residency is canceled. It does mean, however, that you would lose the flat rate for Social Security for the first year. So that is around 88 euros this year. So instead of the flat rate for the first year monthly, you will immediately be brought to the graduated rate, which is a percentage of your income. So on top of that, on top of losing the flat rate, you will also be subject to penalties and surcharges because that letter or that cancellation notice will contain a provision that will say that you have to make sure that you're registered as of the day after approval. So it can be fixed, but it can cost a lot, and you can avoid it just by making sure that you prioritize opening a bank account as well as signing up for Social Security and taxes after approval. We are done with Social Security and taxes. Now let's talk about TIE appointments. So this is almost the last step in most of your engagement with us or in most of your DNV process if you're doing this yourself. And this is your physical residence card. Note that on the approval letter, it will say that you have to obtain this within 30 days. But they know that it is very difficult to obtain tea appointments, especially starting May. What we've noticed before is we would normally be able to book around 10 to 15 appointments on a weekly basis. But that has really significantly reduced since May because it is really difficult to obtain. Historically, it was possible for places like Madrid or Barcelona, and it's still possible, but I will already caution you that it is a challenge. So whether you are with us or whether you're with someone else, extend a little bit of grace when it comes to these because it is difficult right now, and I only foresee it to become even more difficult because I'm now seeing that the approvals for the regularization here in Spain starting to come out, and those same people will also have to apply for TIA appointments. So that's again another increase in competition for those slots because the TIA appointments, they're not just hanging on a fruit. I would say it's always on a first come first serve basis, and there are several stations who normally regularly release it at the same time. But this has also been changing because, for example, for Barcelona, they used to release every 2 p.m. or 3 p.m. on Thursdays. But lately, we've noticed that they varied release times a little bit. And it's common with other stations as well. So they might have been releasing 7 a.m. on Mondays, but then now they're changing release times. And I think it's also to help combat like the bots who are trying to target these applications. Right now on our end, we just have someone really focused on trying to book appointments for our applicants. And again, if you're doing this yourself, there's really no shortcut. It's really just trying to access the page at random times, at random days. And then, of course, also trying to see if there's actually a regular release time for your province. Some provinces are easier than others. So, for example, if you're a smaller province, you don't have as much competition, then naturally, of course, those are easier provinces to get to. Right now, it is very difficult for Alicante and Barcelona. But for other provinces, this can always change because I think around this time last year, it was also quite impossible for Valencia. There is a lot of patience needed at this step of the process. But what then happens is once you get your appointment, you bring your forms, your photo, and then your bank payment for the TASA. You have your fingerprints taken. And then 30 to 40 days after, you will either need a second appointment or if depends on the station, if you don't need an appointment, you'll then go back with the receipt that you received from your first appointment and then you would obtain your residence card. So this is the whole gamut of changes that we've seen for 2026 so far. And it looks like they're changing the rules a little bit more often now because before usually they would change maybe once a year. Now it looks like every quarter, every 2 months or so, there is a change when it comes to the requirements or even like the post-approval process. So follow along Lakbyte if you want to keep updated with these changes, or book a consult through our website, lakbyte.com, if you want specific guided help when it comes to your application. But thank you so much for staying with me. I know this is a little bit of a lengthy video, but there were a lot of changes. There were a lot of updates that we wanted to share, that I wanted to share with all of you. So thank you for sticking until the end and until the next video.